Blog Talk Radio.
Quiet.
Blog Talk Radio.
You are now listening to True Murder, the most shocking killers in true crime history, and the authors that have written about them. Gacy, Bundy, Dahmer, The Night Stalker, BTK. Every week, another fascinating author talking about the most shocking and infamous killers in true crime history. True Murder, with your host, journalist and author, Dan Zupansky.
Good evening. Hello, this is your host, Dan Zupansky, for the program True Murder, the most shocking killers in true crime history, and the authors that have written about them. On November 30th, 1989, in Florida, a man was shot 4 times by a naked, hard-faced, blonde prostitute. He suffered a slow, agonizing death, while the woman stripped him of his valuables. Quiet.
Blog Talk Radio.
You are now listening to True Murder, the most shocking killers in true crime history, and the authors that have written about them. Gacy, Bundy, Dahmer, The Night Stalker, BTK. Every week, another fascinating author talking about the most shocking and infamous killers in true crime history. True Murder, with your host, journalist and author, Dan Zupansky.
Good evening. This is your host, Dan Zupansky, for the program True Murder, the most shocking killers in true crime history, and the authors that have written about them. Pardon me. On a moonlit night in November 1997, 14-year-old Reena Virk went to a party with some of her friends near the idyllic waters of Victoria, British Columbia. She never returned home. A week later, her body was found by police divers, and 8 teenagers, 7 of them girls, were arrested. 2 teens, Warren Glowacki and Kelly Ellard, were charged and eventually convicted for their role in a vicious and unexpected crime. In Under the Bridge, author Rebecca Godfrey unravels the haunting, compelling tale behind this terrible murder and the long, often bizarre trials of the now notorious Kelly Ellard. Drawing on exclusive interviews and 6 years of research, Godfrey reveals the complex story behind the headlines, offering readers a vivid portrait of suburban teenagers, persistent detectives, and stunned parents caught up and transformed by a Canadian tragedy. Under the Bridge, the true story of the murder of Reena Virk, with my special guest, journalist and author Rebecca Godfrey. Thank you very much for agreeing to this interview, and welcome to the program, Rebecca Godfrey.
Hi.
Sorry about that mistake at the beginning. I don't know how that file got underway, but I'm hoping we have no more glitches for the rest of the show, and I apologize. Now, first off, Rebecca, I want to know what made you decide to write about this particular murder case, and what year did this murder take place?
And the murder took place in 97, and it may not be so familiar to your American audience, but in Canada it became, sort of our O.J. Simpson, and it was front page news and a huge story, mainly because, usually, as your introduction mentions, the people associated with grisly murders are men and, the Bundy, Dahmer type, and this was these very, attractive, fresh-faced young girls charged in a very grisly murder. So it became a huge story, and it had happened. I was living in New York at the time and read about it in the New York Times, but it happened in my hometown, Victoria, in Canada, where I'd grown up, and so I felt some connection or interest, and I was also drawn in because there was so little coming from the teenagers. It was written about a lot, but the teenagers weren't talking to the media, and so it was really a mystery, a true murder mystery of what had happened. And we had very vague media reports, so that was right. What got me interested.
Okay, so you were in New York City at the time, but this was your hometown, so obviously it struck home. I mean, this is something you could relate to. Now, tell us about what is the city where this story centers around. We mentioned it. I know where it is, obviously, but for our American audience, what is the city where this story centers around, and what kind of community was it?
It's on the west coast of Canada, and it's Vancouver Island near Washington State, and it's a very extremely beautiful island. It's main source of income is from tourists who come to look at the gardens, and there is a British heritage, so there's tea rooms and double-decker buses, so it's very charming on the surface. Having grown up there, I know there was also a kind of David Lynch, weird side to it, and there'd been some strange murders before, so it's a very, there's a rainy, kind of gloomy place, but also quite beautiful. The murder itself happened in a community. It's an island, so it was a community near the water and a pretty sort of middle to working class neighborhood. But this was the first murder a lot of the detectives had worked on. I think this was a teenage girl hadn't been murdered in the town maybe in 10 years. So it was unexpected, and that's again why people were so shocked by it. It wasn't Toronto, an urban city. It's a very low crime rate town.
Sure. Now, the central figure in this tragic story, of course, is Reena Virk. What was her family life like, and from all your research, and how old was she at this time? Tell us about Reena Virk.
She was 14 and having a bit of a rough time. She was a girl that didn't really seem like she had found her group. She wasn't getting along with her family. She had run away several times, which is why when the police heard about the case, they initially didn't investigate because they thought she was missing. When her parents reported her missing, they just thought, oh, she's run away, and they didn't look into it. So I was having time. She was very sweet, not violent, just sort of lost and looking to find some group where she belonged, and she became sort of drawn and attracted to this tougher group of girls.
Was she originally from the island, or she had moved there, or was there a change of schools or something? No,
she'd grown up there. Yeah, her family had a background from India, but her mother was born in Canada. Her dad had immigrated.
So were they an old world type family, though, despite not being from, not necessarily, obviously being Canadian, but was there...
Right.
Explain was it just normal 14-year-old angst that she was dealing with her parents, or what were the problems? So elaborate a little bit on why she had a little bit of problems with her family, and why did she not fit in?
Yeah. I mean, I think her family was more traditional and, serious values with a curfew and no smoking, and she was meeting kids whose parents were more relaxed, and so she... there was conflict with her family there. She wanted looser rules, and her family were Jehovah's Witnesses. I don't know how much that played into it too. The sort of culture clash and rigid rules. So, but she had very loving grandparents and aunts and uncles, a sort of extended family that she was close to. She lived for a while with her grandparents, but at a certain point, she, just clashed with her parents and went into a group home with girls from tougher backgrounds.
Okay, so she made it to a group home. Did she have any run-ins with the law at all? And how did she have run-ins at school? How was she as a student, just as a student at school?
I think she was probably a good student, but she was overweight, and I don't know if her race played into it, being East Indian, but she was sort of picked on and teased at school, so she stopped going to school.
Oh, really?
So she was sort of, a misfit and not the popular kid at all.
Okay, and so at this 14 years of age, when we're getting around to this story, we'll go back to maybe just previous to that, maybe the year before or preceding this whole terrible event. What is happening in Reena Virk's life? You say she's a misfit. You've described her as that, not really fitting in, overweight, maybe some self-esteem problems, East Indian background, and that sometimes is open to ridicule for some people. Traditional family where she's at odds with her family because of their religious background and maybe even their cultural background. Tell us what happens in the last 6 months or the preceding 6 months before that. What happens in Reena Virk's life? You would mention that she's meeting a tougher crowd. Tell us a little bit more about some of the relationships that she's having.
I think she was very desperate to have friends and was finding that difficult. And that's part of what made the whole story so heartbreaking was, the final night of her life, these girls phoned and invited her to a party, and she thought they were finally inviting her to a party, and actually they had planned to beat her up. So, that was her search, was to find a group of people that liked her, and she adored and sort of idolized this group of girls at that time. I don't know, if you remember, but 97 in the pop culture, it was a lot of hip-hop culture and kids of, all races kind of emulating American gang culture. And so these suburban girls were all sort of pretending they were gangsters and acting, wearing the baggy pants. And so she was doing that and painting her nails blue and talking gangster talk, and then she met these girls and really became fascinated with them and tried to be friends with them, and ended up doing things that just infuriated them. She stole, very petty teenage girl things, stole a girl's address book and started calling people in that book and telling, saying gossip, and so this set off this chain of events.
Okay, well, let's go back a little bit, just to give us a little bit more background for people that are following the story that don't know the story completely. Now, you've mentioned that she's maybe, hanging with a tougher crowd. Let's introduce some of these characters so you can describe some of these characters that are in this story here. Let's start with Warren Glowacki. What was the background, and what can you tell us about Warren Glowacki?
Well, Warren, actually, we can get into it more, but the girls that Reena met initially didn't include Warren. Warren didn't even know Reena, but he was sort of in a parallel, sadly in a kind of parallel stage to her. At the same time, he was also kind of lost, and he had moved to Victoria recently. His dad and mother had split up. His dad had taken him to Victoria, and his dad had met a woman from California and had decided he would go live with this woman and leave Warren in Victoria alone. So Warren was living with a friend, sleeping on a friend's place, and his mother was an alcoholic, so he didn't have any contact with her. But he was much more than Reena, very popular, very charming, really had that sort of Justin Bieber. He really looked like Justin Bieber, kind of that androgynous cuteness, and he was extremely popular kid.
What was his, he went by a moniker himself, sort of a hip-hop moniker.
Yeah, they all kind of had these hip-hop names, so he went by Warren G, his California rapper.
Okay, now Warren Glowacki, Warren G, he was a little bit older, right?
Yeah, he was 16, yeah.
Okay, so now tell us the posse that Reena Virk was trying to hang with. Maybe you can introduce these characters. Obviously, there's Kelly Ellard, but explain the girls that Reena Virk first met, I guess. Get the chronological order for our audience. Which girls did they meet? And then tell us about the character of that one girl, and we'll proceed with the other characters that are in this tragic story. Okay.
First of all, in Canada, there's a law that you have to change the names of anybody who's charged as a minor. So these aren't their real names. But there was the main girl. There was a group home called Seven Oaks, which was for girls that needed temporary shelter, girls that had been kicked out of the house, sometimes waiting for a foster home. Most of those girls, probably all of those girls, had also been in and out of the juvenile detention home and had some kind of criminal background. And the main girl there was who I call Josephine Bell, was a really interesting character. I don't think anybody, your audience probably come across this type of character, but she is, except in, maybe a noir book, but she was very beautiful, blonde, ballerina kind of looks, but she had a really strong desire to be a gangster, to be tough, to have, she literally had minions running around. She would order them to go shoplift for her. She really loved this idea of her reputation, that she was considered, somebody, and people admired her and were frightened of her. And part of that was a bit fantasy, but part of it, she was, she did have a lot of authority and kind of charisma, and she would steal cars, and she was just kind of a quote badass, but at the same time very petite and blonde and attractive. And so she was sort of the main one that Reena was drawn to. Then her sidekick was a girl I called Dusty, who was from a large family. I think there was 7 or 8 sisters, and she'd been kicked out of the house and been living all over the place. And she went to live with one of her sisters and stole cars, and was just too much trouble. So they sent her home, and she ended up in this group home. So she was not quite as sort of insane, crazy as Josephine, but very legitimately tough, quite big, quite strong, constantly getting in fights with people. And so those two were really, the worst pair that Reena could have met. While Dusty was living out of town, Dusty and her were friends, I think, for a little bit. While Dusty was away, she took up with Dusty's boyfriend, which infuriated Dusty, and was wearing his coat. And then there was this incident where she stole Josephine's notebook. So, I mean, it's very petty, and I think that's part of why when the police first heard about this, they couldn't believe it, because the whole way these girls talked about their anger with each other, so classically adolescent. They were really, genuinely immature. They were 14 and 15 and fighting over boys and clothes, and
sure.
So. But then there were this character Josephine had quite a violent streak, so she began.
Was she a real leader, though? Sorry, excuse me, but was she a real leader of these girls? I mean, was she able? You said that she had people shoplifting for her, but was she real?
Correct.
They would look up to her and listen to her?
I think within a small group. I think within the small group. I think that she could orchestrate things. I mean, she was overheard before the murder, planning ways to kill Reena, and discussing let's dig a grave. So she had a sort of authority over a few of them. Okay,
well, tell us the rest of the characters in this little group of people that are involved. We mentioned Dusty, and we haven't mentioned Kelly Ellard, and we haven't mentioned Sarita. Right. Mention the other girls that are directly involved, and then we'll proceed from there.
Well, Kelly Ellard, which is her real name because she was tried as an adult, even though she was the same age. She was Josephine's best friend. They'd been best friends for a long time, and they describe each other as sisters. And she, of all of this group, including Reena, she came from the most stable home, and sort of the most middle class home, but had always been, I don't know always, but recently had been showing kind of behaving violently, getting in fights at school, getting kicked out of school. And so her and Josephine were quite close, and I guess that she had never met Reena, she didn't live in the group home, but when she heard about Reena doing this to her friend, Reena was spreading rumors that Josephine had AIDS and something about her, her eyebrows were fake, so she was.
Well, the AIDS rumor would be quite serious. That's a quite serious allegation.
Yeah. So this was like a bad mix of people that Reena got involved with, and they all sort of fed off each other, and the three girls. And then there was a fourth. Basically, they set up a plan to beat up Reena and lured her out, and then they invited a couple of other girls that were known for fighting. One girl was a kickbox champion, and
wow.
And so they called around. A lot of girls didn't take up the offer, but it was a very organized payback that they were planning.
Now, what happens in your book? There is an interesting development that happens. Elaine Bell, you call it the conversation. Her mother, and if the mother heard, there was some talk about killing someone or killing Reena.
Right.
Tell us about when that conversation happened and what happened in that conversation, and what did Elaine Bell do as a result of that conversation?
Yeah, that was a pretty stunning thing. That there was a day that Josephine came home from the group home and went home to her mom and said, "I feel sick," and was not going to school and was lying on the sofa, and her mother overheard her calling Kelly and talking about ways to kill somebody. Let's dig a grave. I think her mother, was just hearing the one side of the conversation, and her daughter was laughing and let's dig a grave. Oh, I couldn't do that. And there was a lot of talk about burying her and covering her with leaves and giggling. And so you would think that most mothers would, be stunned and ask their daughter and give them a talking to. And she just kind of took her daughter shopping after that for some clothes.
As therapy, you mean? How did she ignore it? How did she ignore it? She just thought, well, maybe a good shopping spree will help, that kind of anger?
I think a recurring thing with all these parents that I witnessed and spoke to is just, you don't know if it's indifference or denial, but they just did not deal with their kids'
real
signs
denial.
of violence. Yeah.
Real denial. Now, you mentioned, you touched on the AIDS. So was that was the turning point? Was apparently that Reena had called and said that Josephine had AIDS, right? That's what happened?
I think that was one of them. I think, and she had the jacket of Dusty's boyfriend, and then there was an older boy in town that these girls liked, and she had started calling him and asking him out on dates, and she had called
Warren G. She had called Warren G. as well, hadn't she? And he didn't know who it was?
No, she called a different boy named Colin.
Okay, pardon me, Colin.
Colin, and he didn't know, and so he realized, she got his number from from Josephine. So he was angry. So it was just, a general. Yeah. They were just angry about all these things. Yeah, it was an escalating anger.
Now, I know you'll probably never know, and no one will know. But what was in Reena Virk's mind? She wants to fit in. Is she? She's not this naive to realize that this is not going to work. So, do you have any indication of what was going on in her mind?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think all I can think, she's sort of the missing person we can't hear from, or nobody knows what her experience was. And but I think that maybe she thought, these girls weren't that friendly to her. She tried to be friends with them, and maybe she just thought, I'll show them, I can be as tough and mean as they can. That would be my guess.
But then why would she go to the party so unsuspecting? These girls are trying to be gangsters, so again, and nothing in the book indicates that they were really too clever.
Right.
Really. They're young and they're not experienced, thank God. But so the thing is Is there any indication that she had any doubt at all, any trepidation whatsoever about all of a sudden being included in a party? Was there any trepidation at any point?
Yeah, I think there was. I mean, I think she said on the phone, I heard you wanted to kick my ass, and they said, no, but we're not mad anymore, and we forgive you. And I think that she just had such a longing for that to be true, and just thought that, and when you're a teenage girl, that desire, I just remember there's a party and you just have such a pull to be there and to be part of something. Yeah.
Now, tell us about that fateful night of November 17th, and if you could go back, maybe tell us about the day of November 17th, the last day of Reena Virk's young life. What did she do that day? She was going to that party, and she knew that. Obviously, she knew about this party just before, the day before. I'm sorry.
No, I think she went back home actually to see her parents. She was living somewhere else, but she came back home. I think she was going to spend the night with her parents. So she had a knapsack with her diary and her pajamas, and then her plan was to, the next day, she was very close to her uncle, and he was going to pick her up, and they were going to go shopping for a teddy bear. I think it was, somebody in her family had recently had a baby. And so she just had a typical day, and then she came home with her family. She was having soup at dinner time. I think she told her family she was dieting. And her brother was there. She had a younger brother that she was close to, and they were going to just play games that evening. So it was, a typical day and kind of hopeful in the sense that she was with her parents and having time with her family, and had this plan the next day to go shopping with her uncle. So she, there was nothing really unusual for her that day.
Now, what happened that night? Where did this fateful night start? What time was it? Earlier in the evening? What happened? Let us take our audience through this event.
All right. Well, at the school, and this was pretty typical when I grew up in that community too, that there were parties. Kids would party. I mean, I didn't quite do it that young, but these kids were 14 and 13 and 15. But there were parties on the field. I don't know if you guys do that.
Sure.
So that's sort of a large space, yeah. So the kids meet up there and pour their alcohol into their lemonade, bottles or whatever. So that was what they did every Friday night at the school. Shoreline. Shoreline was a school that none of Kelly went to, but Reena didn't go to. I think Josephine had been kicked out of. I don't think Dusty was in school either. So Kelly was in the process of being kicked out, and they had actually brought her in for anger management classes, and she was about to be kicked out, and Warren went there. And then in Warren's group was a whole completely different group of girls who were much more, not, I would say, the kind of cheerleader group, though they didn't have cheerleaders at the school, but they were the more pretty, fun-loving, girls. They weren't criminal, and they weren't in this gangster thing. So it was just a huge group of students, 50 to 60 students, and that was where, so they were there partying. What happened was that group, somebody at the school, at the party, threw a rock through the window and of the school. A janitor called the police. So the kids all took off, and as they did that, they joined forces with this other group of kids, which included Reena and Josephine and Kelly, and so this whole large group kind of got drawn into this plot that they had didn't have any idea about. So all the kids made their way away from the school where they thought the police were coming, and there was an area under a bridge. So some of the kids went under there, and as planned, once they were under there, then that's when Josephine and Kelly and Dusty started beating up Reena. And it was pretty vicious. And then these other kids from Shoreline who were there, some of them jumped in, including Warren, who really didn't know any of these girls and didn't know anything about the fight, 2 other girls that, it was just this moment of kind of, I describe it like these matches and someone lit a match and this fire went off and this rage of these kids came out, and then Reena was there. A lot of the other girls especially were kind of horrified and ran away, and including a lot of Warren's friends. And so that was how it started. So it was a very unlikely incident in that, this sort of criminal plot brought in and gathered in all these other kids.
Who hit her first? Who was it? Was it Josephine?
Well, Josephine put a cigarette out on her face.
Okay, and then what happened? Did
and
Reena
then
start
Kelly,
to fight
then
back?
she sort of pushed. She tried to get away, and Kelly punched her. And then another girl tripped her, and she fell. And she kept trying to get away, and they just kept pushing her and punching her. And then Warren kicked her.
Were they stomping her and kicking her as well in the end?
I don't think they were stomping her, no, but they were, one girl would kick her and punch her in the back of the head, and Warren would kick her, and she would try to leave, and she, and then the kickboxer girl actually said she's had enough, stop it, and everybody stopped, and they left her kind of down there in the mud.
Okay. How many people were around at that time? You say there was the kickboxer, which is Warren's friend, and another girl. And so there's Dusty, Kelly, Josephine, Reena, Warren. Am I correct on that?
Yeah. There's another girl called Eve and another girl called Maya and another one other girl. So there were eight kids in the fight, in the sort of immediate circle fight, and then 10 to 15 kids witnessing it and watching it.
Okay.
Who were doing nothing.
Okay, and so when they left her in the mud, how many people left? Because this doesn't end. So how many people left?
Well, ostensibly they all left, and then that's kind of where the mystery begins, because they all left. A lot of them had curfews. Their parents were coming to pick them up, and everybody witnessed this leaving. A lot of parents saw the kids getting into cars, and a lot of kids left. They saw Reena. She was down there, and then a few kids finally admitted they saw Reena get up and by herself, which must have been horrifying for her. She was bleeding and sort of stumbling, and she started to walk across this bridge to go back home, and then there were two figures seen following her. And that would, turn out to be, or, the police theory was that those figures were Warren and Kelly, and then she was also, so they were seen following her across the bridge, and then later that night they were seen coming back across the bridge by themselves without Reena.
How did she ultimately die?
She was found drowned in a body of water called the Gorge, and she had sustained huge injuries. The coroner described it as, injuries that you see when someone's run over by a car. Her organs were crushed, but the official cause of death was drowning. She'd been dragged into the water.
So obviously there was far more damage than was initially inflicted, and also wasn't she was half naked? She was described as being found half naked as well. So
yeah, I think what happened was, nobody knows, but when they dragged her into the water, her pants fell off, and I think her shirt, probably just floated off in the water.
I see. I got it. Okay, so there was never any talk of sexual abuse or anything, or a sexual assault or anything like that. Okay.
No.
Okay, so thank God for that. Anyway. Okay, now so now obviously we have you've alluded that obviously no one really knows, and so we're obviously going to get to eventually to a trial, but after this has happened, all those people have left. Give us what has happened what happens after. Obviously, Reena's parents have called police, and initially they just think, well, maybe because she's a runaway, but what happens? Give us some events after that, because it's very interesting. What happens after? All those witnesses, does anybody call police?
what happens?
That's where the story gets really, fascinating, is that here all these kids, 15 to 20 kids, had witnessed this fight, which you think alone would have been brutal enough, but then the kids were all hearing rumors of that the fight had turned into a murder and that somebody had got killed. But nobody talked to the police. Nobody even talked to their parents about the fight.
Wow.
Nobody talked to a teacher. And Reena's parents called the police several times and reported Reena missing. This was before the era of cell phones and all of that, so you have to keep in mind that it was sort of easier to disappear as a girl. And so it was, the police just thought, well, this girl just probably ran away. They didn't investigate. And meanwhile, these rumors were getting more and more rampant, more and more exaggerated. There was rumors that she'd been, her arm had been pulled off, and these kids were just all whispering about it, and yet nobody came forward, and it took the police, it wasn't until a week later that arrests were made. So for 7 days.
How did they come about to make arrests? How did that come about?
And that was really, that was one thing that I really explore in Under the Bridge, because it was never public, but there were two sisters who were living in this group home with Josephine, and were both more or less abandoned, orphaned, had no family, and were there. Well, I guess one sister was there, and Josephine started bragging about this. Oh, we killed this girl, very proud, and they were sort of horrified. I think the younger sister had met Reena, and so even though they were not like goody-goody girls, and they found it against their code to go to the police, they did go to the police. I guess they called Reena's mom, and Reena's mom told them that Reena was missing, and she was frightened, and in their words, the mother sounded so upset, and so they went to the police, and the police kind of didn't laugh them out of there, but just were like, what, these two girls come in at 14 and 16 and tell you a bunch of girls killed another girl. So they thought it was, quote, far-fetched, and just ignored it. And then these two sisters, they became kind of like detectives. They went back and they asked Josephine, like, show me where you did it. They went to the scene of the crime, and she actually obviously didn't know what happened. Kelly had told her, so she tried to reenact it, but she herself didn't know much. So the sisters, they got names of people. They went back to the police and sort of screamed at the police, do something. Almost, I think it was really brave of them in a sense, and they gave the police the names they had. So the police did another investigation, and one of the police recognized one of the names of the girls involved and had a kind of relationship with her, a friendship with her, and went and talked to her, and she spilled the beans. So then they started rounding up the kids, and they had a kind of crazy night where they brought in, I think, like 30 to 40 teenagers, and the teenagers were screaming and crying, and they started arresting people, and it was like detectives had never seen anything like this. They had the cell full of these girls screaming and crying and very young and scared, and so, and then even then they really didn't know what had happened. It was very difficult because there were so many rumors, and it was just, usually you find the body and then you start the investigation, and in this case they just had this rumor from these girls that some girl named, half of them didn't even know her name. Some girl, they had her name wrong. Risa had been killed, and they had no body. So it was they called it a very unusual investigation. Finally, they went to the gorge and had divers go in and found the body. But even then, they had no evidence, no gun or fingerprints. They had this body and all these stories of girls, and the girls were very loyal to each other, and none of them would talk, and if they did talk, they told stories that didn't make sense or contradicted each other. So
right. It was a big mess.
Yeah,
big mess for Sergeant Bob Wall and some of the other detectives. Now, eventually, how long did it take them to sort the whole thing out and lay the definitive charges and identify who was going to be their, say, star witness or witness for the prosecution? How long did it take them to sort of sort this out and make for them to sort out who they thought were the principal players in this?
I think once they had, after the 8 days, once they had all the kids in custody, and they really did an incredible amount of it was a huge investigation. They brought in 3 different, teams of police, and they were interrogating kids constantly and through all hours of the night. And once that started, I guess, the first witness that they found who helped them was Sarita, who was Warren's girlfriend, because he had confessed to her, and she told the police about this confession. And she had washed his... Go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead. No, I was going to say she washed his jeans and his shirt.
Yeah, which had blood on them. So that was sort of their first, clue of his involvement.
And why? I know that you talk about at trial that there's quite a bit of talk about her, I guess, conflict. She did like Warren, but however, she didn't. She had a moral code, and she did testify there was a little bit of blood on the clothes, and she did wash the clothes, and everything that he did say. But you do talk about that from your research, and I guess from your interviews, she really was conflicted by what she had to do.
Yeah, I saw her during the trial, his trial. She was the star witness against him, and she was very reluctant, very, I would say hostile, but she did not want to be there. And they played in court her initial testimony, which was really heartbreaking because it was almost like as she told the detective what he had told her, she started to realize it was true and that her boyfriend had killed somebody, and she started crying, and he had told her that the blood was there because he got in a fight, and she just couldn't believe he was like, this sweet little boy that he could do that. So, or she had convinced herself that it was just a bad story, in her words. So it wasn't until he was arrested and the body was found that she faced this, and then she really suffered because of that. And then the police kind of honed in on her as she was really the only one that came forward, so they wanted to build the whole case around her. Because meanwhile, Kelly was clamming up with expensive lawyers and not talking. They had nothing on Kelly, and Josephine, who really was the sort of perpetrator, or the instigator, refused to give a statement. So they could more easily build a case on Warren, and so they really went after her.
Okay, now, so even though they didn't have either Kelly's or Warren's actual testimony, were they able to make a conviction at trial? Were they able to convict?
Well, Warren did confess. They really went after him. I think initially everyone believed. What was so sort of surprising even to me when I started researching was I thought Warren, you just hear, okay, 8 girls have been arrested. You see them. I saw them all. They're very just ordinary-looking girls, like you'd see in a mall. And there's this one boy, and you think like it's just human nature for what we know, boys and girls, that you think it's the boy. So the whole sort of prosecution theory and police interrogation was really to focus on Warren and that he must have done it all, and he must have been really the true killer, and then these other girls were just kind of there, and but they didn't actually do it. So that was everybody's theory. Then when you started, talking to more people, you get a completely different picture of what happened. And so even Warren was pretty quick to open up and confess, and he said that his story was that he had followed her with Kelly beaten her up some more, and then Kelly started dragging her into the water, and he said stop, and Kelly kept doing it, and then Kelly held her head underwater until she died, and that was his story. And people didn't believe it, but as more evidence came forward, and it was more or less true.
So she didn't take the stand, but he did take the stand?
Well, they were tried separately. He was tried first, and it was really interesting, in terms of class and, sex, like who, he was tried first as the boy. He didn't get out on bail. She got out on bail. She came from a more, I don't know if her family had money or she got a high-profile lawyer. His lawyer had never done a murder case. His lawyer told him to have a trial with judge only, so he didn't have a jury trial. He was tried very quickly. Wow. And, and somewhat the sort of rage of the city was on him. People really wanted him not to take the fall because he was involved, but, so he did take the stand. He did tell the story, but it was sort of, laughed at and mocked, and then he was sent to maximum security prison when he was, it was 5'2", 16-year-old boy. Meanwhile, Kelly was out on bail. Her lawyers kept fighting, trying to appeal things. She didn't go to trial for almost a year. And then she took the stand, and she looked very schoolgirly and spoke in a sweet, high voice, and said that she hadn't been there, she hadn't done anything. These were just rumors that people spread about her, and they had one piece of evidence on her, which was quite strong, which was her coat had salt stains on it that matched the salt in the gorge where Reena's body was found. That wasn't admitted in her first trial. Her statement, her interview, even though she didn't say anything, you sort of watching it can see that she's guilty just by the way she's fudging, and the police leave the room and she starts screaming and swearing and saying, I'm going to kill whoever told on me, and da-da. So, there was that also wasn't admitted. So in her first trial, she was still found guilty, but then it was overturned. And she was also on house arrest all during her trial. So then, as the book explores, then she had a second and third trial, which is pretty unprecedented.
Yes. So what was the reason for the first and second and third? Why was she needing another trial? What was the issue?
The first trial, they appealed, her lawyers, and said she was questioned improperly on the stand. I guess the prosecution asked her, her story was, I didn't do this, and all these girls, I just heard about this, all these girls started saying this about me. And, the prosecution, the defense could say, well, you know how girls are, and they pick on one girl and start these rumors. So that was her defense, and then the prosecution asked her, why would they do this? Why would all these people, all these witnesses that have come forward who apparently you confessed to, because she did brag to a lot of people that she killed Reena, why would they all make this up? And she said, I don't know. And I guess that was considered, you can't ask.
A question of someone else.
Yeah.
What somebody else had to say. Okay, you can only ask the defendant what they had to say, not what someone else, a hearsay. Is that what I'm getting out of it?
Or try to explain their motive. It's like an unfair burden on them to try to say,
Okay, so what?
Explain that to them.
So what happened with the second trial? So what happened? Did they have to have a third trial?
So there was a second trial where she really kind of showed her true colors for the first time. She had a very good female prosecutor kind of went after her because her story really didn't make any sense. She said she walked around and there was no witnesses, and she was seen on the, she was seen coming back across the bridge and confessed even that night to someone who bumped into her, I just killed somebody, what should I do? And so her story of where she'd been and what she'd done, she had no alibi, or it just didn't make any sense. So as they pushed her, she started screaming at the prosecutor, shut up, leave me alone. And we all sort of saw this violent girl, and you you saw somebody that was just had this explosive rage. So it seemed pretty certain that, as well as, they had quite a good case against her, that she would be convicted, but it was a hung jury, so it was a mistrial.
Interesting. So what did she finally get in the third trial? What was she convicted of finally?
She's convicted of second-degree murder and has a life sentence. She's eligible for parole, but she only they appealed also that conviction.
Sure.
And they won. It was overturned, her third conviction, and then the prosecution took it to the Supreme Court, who upheld it. So she's really been it's been dragging out forever. So interestingly, Warren, through all this, he went to jail right away and served his time. He never appealed or had free trials or this or that, and he's out of prison. I think he appealed the first conviction, but it was kind of cursory and not very serious. Not didn't go to any higher courts.
Right.
But he's out of prison now.
How many years did he actually spend physically in prison?
I guess 13 years. 13
years?
Yeah.
You know what's interesting to me? I understand Canadian law pretty well, and it is very, very unusual for a person not to get out on bail. I know it's a murder trial, but he's not a flight risk, and he's quite young. That's a pretty poor defense lawyer. They cannot, because in some cases people want to spend the double time credit because they're pretty certain they're going to be convicted. In a particular case with a young man like that,
but he had no family. He had no family there, so there was just nobody to.
Yeah, it's quite unfair, for sure. I don't feel sorry for killers too often or people involved in these types of things, but there's obviously a little. Obviously, you pointed out there's quite a difference in the defense that those two people could afford or had, regardless.
Right. Well, she had exceptional lawyers, just incredible lawyers. Sure. It was also a really hard case to try because there was no physical evidence except for that coat, but mostly you had all these teenager stories, and the teenagers were not the most articulate witnesses. They were like teenagers. They were surly and had attitude and were, contradictory or couldn't, if they lied originally, and now were telling the truth, they couldn't explain that. They would get defensive. So it was almost comical at times watching these kids come up because they were, every word was and they were
Valley girls,
sarcastic, and so it was hard. And also, I think there really was this perception that a girl is not capable of physical violence and at this level, and that really worked in her favor, whether people consciously think that or, it was definitely there. It's just easier, or it's just we've seen so many murders of these 40-year-old creepy looking guys. When you see a pretty girl who's 5'2", it defies belief that she could do this.
Well, sure, and I think the thing is when you have good representation and the lawyer advises you wisely to dress a certain way and have your hair a certain way and present yourself a certain way, and then he does his job in presenting you a certain way, then, I think historically men are obviously more often killers, and, it's even unusual for a woman serial killer. That's a very unusual thing, and you are seeing a lot of stories that are quite popular now that where kids kill, mom said kill, or things like that, which is really shocking to people. I think people realize that there's certainly the Willie Pictons around and Robert Pictons around, but the young kids it really is unnerving to the public, and I think that's why this case was so high profile. It was just the indifference. Like you say, nobody even told their parents. It's like, you're in a little. I was just in Victoria a couple of years ago. It's such a beautiful paradise. Really, it is the jewel of Canada. It really is. So to imagine something like that, and kids being just as bad as they are here in crime capital of Canada, Winnipeg, or anywhere else, it is unnerving to people because I think really that you always hear that. Oh, in my neighborhood, how unusual. It's Victoria is the most if you were to ask people, this is the place, this is least likely to happen, I think that's why the whole community and the country was so unnerved.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, they really do call it paradise. It looks, that's what people think. It's just, yeah.
So, is there any conclusions you have, any commentary you have from, what have you learned from this whole process, with the court process? And did you agree with the verdict? Tell us just a little bit about what you got from this, other than this fine book, but what did you get out of it? What are your kind of conclusions, or some of the things that you came to that you would not have come to had you not done this entire process in this case?
I guess I think the stories are so much more complex than we see in the media. I mean, this is just, in the media was this murder story of misfit killed by gang girls, and what I really tried to do in the book was show the complexity of this story and the sort of, there is pure evil. We like to think that that's what causes murder, but there's also, good people who get caught up in these things, who are then faced with these moral conflicts between right and wrong, and then so many people acted really bravely, like those sisters, and that you wouldn't expect they were, quote, criminals. And then you have these parents who are, quote, good parents, who ignore the signs of their kids being cruel or bullies. And so I think, whenever we see these stories in the media, we kind of want to just think, oh, these are bad people, and it's so much more complicated. At least this case was so much more layered and more fascinating, and sort of the people and how they ended up here. There was a long history for each of them, what brought them to this place. And I remember Reena's uncle saying, like, if you could just find out how they all met, and even the stories of how all these girls, their lives crossed, and what drew them to this place. And I think with Warren, that he really turned his life around and became somebody who could have just become hardened and bitter, and he worked in prison to kind of become a better person. He ultimately met with the Virk family and spoke with them and really he just changed for the better in a very difficult situation. And then Kelly, you see, is somebody who really has had no remorse. So I think just the complexity of people and the different ways that we all act when we are faced with something like this. How does a parent act when they find out their daughter is talking about beating up somebody? And how does a girlfriend act? Right. How does a girlfriend act when her boyfriend may have done something terrible? And so these sort of moral conflicts that people face. What does a detective do when some girl tells him about something and he sort of scoffs at it and then later realizes he was wrong? So that was, all the human stories that are in one night that you can unfold.
Sure.
In terms of like social issues, I mean, people ask me that a lot. That's the most common question. Like, what can we learn from this? And that was never my approach. I'm not I wasn't writing it from the kind of
well, you can't be expected to do it anyway. I mean,
psychologist, but I was sort of struck by how many of these young teenagers had nothing fulfilling in their life. Whether it was music or sports or something that they could find a purpose with, and that they didn't have good education, they didn't have good parents, so they sort of drifted into this identity of being gangsters, or they were more affected by popular culture. That became kind of what influenced them, because they were just sort of emptiness. So I think if those kids had been exposed to art or sports, or just been given more attention, this wouldn't have happened.
Well, I mean, the thing is, I always hear that in Canada, but I never hear that in America. The thing is, more rec space for killers, potential killers. I personally think if you have the capacity to kill, it's a very unusual thing. I know that there's this phenomena of the mob mentality, or not even a mob mentality, just sort of, like you said, these people just jumped in there and then didn't do anything proper after that as a result, didn't have a conscience either. So you can see that a lot of people don't really care so much, but those people that are capable of doing this horrendous, horrific murder, that is unusual. And so I say, maybe those other people, idle hands, but I don't know, a couple psychopathic people, maybe, like you say, Warren G., but at least one of these people in this book, to me, have no redeeming value.
No, I agree. I mean, I think Kelly was, had all the marks of a psychopath in that sense, and, those people, and then that's where the parents, when they don't sort of react to the signs in their child, that their child is harming, because she had hurt other people before, and so I think that's, it's surprising to me that a parent wouldn't intervene earlier with their child.
Sure. You know what, I just thought we're just going to wrap it up now and just let people know where they can get the book, obviously from Amazon and Barnes & Noble and Chapters and everywhere else, but we'll just give a little bit more information. What I just thought was interesting in your book was that you did a follow-up, and so Josephine Bell is a new dancer, and Sarita, as per the story, is speaking to girls about not getting into the kind of pitfalls that she almost got into.
Yeah.
It's kind of interesting in your book.
Yeah.
Sort of. Because Josephine Bell is one cocky person, that's for sure. And it's really, I got to tell the audience that what's really unusual, or, because I read a lot of true crime and I've interviewed all these people, is that you've done a great job of really getting down to everyone's level by including so many exclusive conversations. And so the way these people are speaking, you really tried to get into their minds, into their mindset to try to understand this. I mean, who can? But you've done a remarkable job in capturing that, and through the conversations that you have been able to get in this book, so it's quite good.
Thank you.
So I want to tell you also, I want to tell our audience that you've been listening to Rebecca Godfrey, and this is her book, Under the Bridge, The True Story of the Murder of Reena Virk. And it's the 2006 British Columbia Award for Canadian Nonfiction, well-deserved. And so tell us about if you have a website or any other contact information, or what you're doing right now, or any new projects in the true crime genre.
I do have a website, and I wasn't a true crime writer. I was a novelist and wrote this, and I was quite, I spent a long 7 years, and it took me a long time to get these kids to talk, and it was quite distressing and a hard book to write, so I've gone back. I'm working on fiction now.
I don't believe you. Yeah, because it's just such an ordeal. It's like these people in America are churning out one of these one a year. I'm going, really?
Right. I don't know how people do it, but yeah. I mean, you can, if you want to do that quickly. I really wanted to, like you say, get all their voices and thoughts, and have a really deep look into their lives, not just take the police report and summarize it. So
absolutely, yeah, you've done a great job, and so yes. So anyway, you've got the website. Can you give us the website? This is RebeccaGodfrey.com.
Yeah.
There we go. And that's Godfrey. If people don't see the, it's Godfrey, Rebecca Godfrey. Under the Bridge, The True Story of the Murder of Reena Virk. Thank you very much, Rebecca, for coming onto the program, and then during the mix-up with our Canadian MTS telephone service. That's who it was. They're to blame. So I want to thank you very much for coming on and doing this interview. It was very, very informative, and I want to thank you very much.
Thank you, Dan.
Well, you have a good night.
Okay.
And I will talk to you soon, and good luck with all your ventures.
Thank you so much.
Okay, good night.
Bye.
Bye-bye. You've been listening to the program True Murder, the most shocking killers in true crime history, with your host, Dan Zupansky. Have a good evening. Good night.